The listening lamp flickers to life, illuminating the space between worlds. Here, science whispers to spirit, and reality bends to imagination. Curl up in the cosmic glow as we unveil the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. The Thread Weaver, a short story written by Rob Corrigan, narrated by Melanie Bishop.
The bell above Julia's shop door chimed in perfect harmony with her loom's shuttle passing through the warp threads. She glanced up to see the Henderson twins entering, their gossamer connection shimmering gold in her perception, a thread that began in their shared womb and now pulsed with 30 years of accumulated moments. But it was the fainter lines extending from them that caught her practiced eye, countless silver strands stretching out into the world, connecting them to people they'd never met through countless generations of chance encounters and shared moments. "Morning, Julia," Sarah Henderson called out, her voice carrying the same warm resonance as her threads. "Any chance that alpaca yarn came in?" Julia's fingers never stopped moving across the loom, the ancient Belgian wood warm beneath her touch. "Just yesterday. You have a perfect timing." She didn't mention that she'd seen their arrival in the subtle shift of threads 10 minutes before the bell rang. Some things were better left unspoken, even in a town that had grown used to her peculiarities. The twins browsed the shelves of carefully arranged skeins, their threads moving in perfect synchronization. Julia returned her focus to her weaving, but not before noticing something odd. A dark spot in the tapestry of connections that usually filled her small shop, a severed thread, its end fraying like smoke in wind. Her hands faltered for the first time in years. In all her time working the loom, she'd never seen a connection simply end. Threads could fade with death, transform with love, tangle with conflict. But sever completely, it shouldn't be possible. The bell chimed again and Julia's breath caught. A young woman stood in the doorway, her threads, or rather the absence of them, creating a void in the usual pattern. Where most people trailed hundreds of connections, this woman had only the barest remnants of severed strands surrounding her like broken spider silk. "Can I help you?" Julia asked, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm looking for yarn for my grandmother," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She used to... before she..." She trailed off, one hand clutching at something invisible around her neck. "Of course," Julia said gently, rising from her loom. "I'm Julia, and you are..." "Stephanie. Stephanie Marshall." As she moved into the shop, Julia saw how the few intact threads around her seemed to recoil from contact with others, creating strange gaps in the usual weave of connections. The Henderson twins, seemingly oblivious to the disturbance in the pattern, approached the counter with their selections. Julia rang up their purchase on autopilot, her attention fixed on the way Stephanie's presence affected the tapestry of threads around her. It was as if grief had become a tangible force, severing connections before they could even form. After the twins left, Julia watched Stephanie drift between shelves of yarn, her fingers brushing skeins without ever quite making contact. Each touch left a shadow in the threads, like frost forming on glass. "Your grandmother," Julia said carefully. "She taught you to knit." Stephanie's hand jerked back from a ball of soft blue wool. "She tried. Before everything happened. Mum was supposed to teach me, but..." Her voice cracked, and Julia saw another thread snap, its end dissolving into nothingness. Julia moved toward her ancient loom, feeling its steady presence like an anchor. The half-finished weaving showed patterns that only she could read, connections between townspeople, histories of love and loss and chance encounters spanning generations. And now, for the first time, she saw gaps appearing in that pattern, centered around this wounded young woman. "Perhaps," Julia said, choosing her words as carefully as she chose her threads, "you'd like to learn now? Sometimes it helps to pick up where others left off." Stephanie looked up, really seeing Julia for the first time. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition maybe, or fear of recognition. "I should go," she said abruptly, turning toward the door. "Wait!" Julia called, but Stephanie was already gone, the bells chime discordant in her wake. Julia returned to her loom, but her hands shook too much to weave. Instead, she studied the pattern before her, seeing how Stephanie's brief presence had affected the threads. The connections were unraveling, not just around Stephanie, but spreading outward like a tear in fabric. She had to do something, but what do you do when the very thing that needs fixing is the ability to connect? The day stretched ahead, full of customers trailing their beautiful, complex webs of connection. Julia helped them choose yarns and patterns, all while watching the darkness spread through the tapestry only she could see. As sunset painted her shop in shades of amber, Julia finally allowed herself to face what she'd been avoiding. She wasn't meant to just observe anymore. Something had chosen her and her loom and her gift for seeing connections, to help heal whatever was broken in Stephanie Marshall. She only hoped she could figure out how before more threads were severed. The loom creaked gently in the gathering darkness, its ancient wood holding centuries of wisdom. Julia ran her fingers along its frame, feeling the resonance of countless weavers before her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patterns to understand. For now, she sat in her quiet shop, watching the threads of human connection shimmer in the fading light, and began to plan. The morning light filtered through Julia's shop windows, catching dust motes that danced between the threads only she could see. She sat at her loom, fingers moving methodically as she studied yesterday's damage. The gaps in the pattern had grown overnight, spreading like cracks in thin ice. "You're worried," came a familiar voice. Martha Chen, her neighbour of 20 years, stood in the doorway clutching a tin of tea. Jasmine, judging by the delicate green threads that always surrounded it. Martha's own connections shimmered with decades of shared mornings just like this one. "Am I that obvious?" Julia asked, not looking up from her work. The shuttle passed smoothly through the warp threads, each pass revealing more of the pattern she was trying to understand. "Only to those who know where to look." Martha set the tea down and studied the loom. Though she couldn't see the threads as Julia did, 20 years of friendship had given her an uncanny sense for when something was amiss. "Tell me what you see." Julia's hands stilled. "It's easier if I show you." She rose and moved to the shop window, Martha following. Outside, people walked down Main Street, carrying their invisible webs of connection. "Look at the Petersons crossing the street." Martha watched as the elderly couple made their way to the cafe. "What about them? Their threads, their connections to others, they've always been strong. Jack Peterson's grandfather once helped Sarah Miller's great-uncle build a barn. That connection still echoes through their weekly coffee meetings, though neither of them knows why they feel such kinship." Julia traced the pattern in the air. "But now—" She didn't need to finish. Even as they watched, another thread dissolved, its end fraying into nothingness. The Petersons paused mid-step, a look of momentary confusion crossing their faces before they continued on. "It's spreading," Julia said quietly. "Whatever's affecting Stephanie Marshall, it's not contained to just her anymore. The severances are multiplying." Martha's expression grew serious. "You've seen something like this before." Julia thought back to her grandmother's last days, when she'd first shown Julia how to use the loom. The ancient wood had hummed beneath her young hands as her grandmother explained its true purpose. "The loom doesn't just show connections," she'd said, her aged fingers guiding Julia's. "It helps maintain them. Every weaving strengthens the bonds between people, even if they don't know they're connected. Once, Julia told Martha now. "When I was first learning. A man lost his entire family in a fire. His grief was so profound it started affecting others, making them pull away from their own connections. But this is different. These threads aren't just weakening, they're being severed completely." She returned to the loom where her latest weaving displayed the pattern of connections centred around the cafe. Through it, she could trace decades of meetings, partings, chance encounters that had shaped the town's social fabric, but now gaps were appearing, places where the patterns simply stopped. "I did some research last night," Julia said, pulling out a folder of newspaper clippings. "Stephanie Marshall's mother died 15 years ago. Car accident on Ridge Road. Stephanie was in the car but survived." Martha picked up one of the articles, her healer's eyes scanning for details Julia might have missed. "Trauma like that, it leaves marks deeper than we can see." "But why now? Why are the severances starting 15 years later?" Before Martha could answer, the bell above the door chimed. Both women turned to see Stephanie standing there, looking as surprised to find herself in the shop as they were to see her. Stephanie started, then seemed to lose her words. In the morning light, Julia could see her threads more clearly, or rather, the absence of them. Where most people's connections spread out like roots or branches, Stephanie was surrounded by void, broken ends dissolving even as new connections tried to form. "Come in," Julia said gently. "I just put on some tea." Martha squeezed Julia's arm, a gesture carrying decades of shared understanding, and slipped out, leaving them alone. Stephanie remained in the doorway, hesitating between flight and something else, something that might have been hope. "I don't know why I came back," she said finally. Julia did. The loom had shown her how connections worked, how even severed threads retained memory of their purpose. Some part of Stephanie was still trying to weave new bonds, even as another part destroyed them. "Perhaps," Julia suggested, "you'd like to see how the loom works. Sometimes watching the pattern form helps us understand our own tangles." Stephanie took a tentative step forward, then another. Julia felt the loom's resonance change, responding to Stephanie's presence. The ancient wood seemed to hum with anticipation or recognition. As Stephanie approached, Julia saw something she'd missed yesterday, a single golden thread, barely visible, stretching from Stephanie's heart into impossibility. It didn't dissolve like the others, but rather faded into dimensions Julia couldn't quite perceive. That thread, she realised, might be the key to everything. But first, she had to help Stephanie see what she was doing to the other connections, and for that, she needed to understand why the severances had started now, 15 years after the loss that had caused them. Julia poured tea into her grandmother's cups, the ones that had witnessed countless conversations like the one they were about to have. Sometimes, she knew, the hardest patterns to weave were the ones that required perfect timing. The morning light caught the steam rising from their cups, making it dance like loose threads waiting to be woven into something new. Now she just had to figure out where to begin. Julia watched Stephanie's hands as she tentatively touched the loom's frame. The ancient wood seemed to respond to her presence, its usual hum deepening to something more complex. Around them, the severed threads hung like broken harp strings, their ends dissolving into the morning air. "It's so old," Stephanie whispered, fingers tracing patterns in the wood grain. "How long has it been in your family?" "The first record we have is from Belgium, 1847, Julia said, carefully watching how the remaining threads around Stephanie reacted to her touch on the loom. "My great-great-grandmother brought it over during the war, though sometimes I think it's older than that. The patterns it shows, they go back further than any records I've found. A customer entered the shop, the bell's chime sending ripples through the visible threads. Mrs. Davidson, whose connections to the town stretched back 5 generations, browsed the wool selection. Julia watched in fascination as the woman's threads recoiled from Stephanie's presence, creating a void in the usually dense tapestry of relationships. "Tell me about your mother," Julia said softly, keeping her eyes on her work. The shuttle moved smoothly through the warp threads, maintaining a rhythm that she hoped would help keep Stephanie grounded. The silence stretched so long that Julia thought she might have pushed too far. Then, barely audible, "She loved to garden. Everyone in town came to her for advice about their plants." Stephanie's fingers tightened on the loom's frame. "After she died, I couldn't even keep a cactus alive." Julia nodded, seeing how that particular thread of connection between Stephanie's mother and the town's gardens had withered over the years. But unlike the recent severances, that fading had been natural, part of grief's normal progression. "And now," she prompted gently, "what's changed recently?" Stephanie's breath caught. Around her, the void in the pattern pulsed darker. "I found her journals last month, in the attic. I'd been avoiding, but the roof needed repair and—" She stopped, struggling. Mrs. Davidson chose that moment to approach the counter, her arms full of yarn. As she passed Stephanie, another thread snapped, a connection that had existed since Mrs. Davidson's mother had taught Stephanie's mother to make strawberry preserves 50 years ago. Julia rang up the purchase, her mind racing. The journals had triggered something, causing Stephanie's grief to transform from passive fading to active severance. But why? After Mrs. Davidson left, Julia rose and moved to the shop's small kitchen. She returned with more tea and her grandmother's honey cake, the one whose recipe had been passed down alongside the loom's secrets. "Sometimes," she said, cutting thick slices of the cake, "connections don't break, they just change form, like this cake. My grandmother taught me to make it just as her grandmother taught her. The original recipe is long gone, but the knowledge survives, transformed by each generation's small changes." Stephanie took a bite, and Julia saw that single golden thread, the one that stretched into impossibility, pulse briefly stronger. "The journals," Stephanie said finally. "They were full of dreams she never got to fulfill, plans for a nursery business, designs for gardens she wanted to plant. She had this whole future mapped out, and then—" the void around her grew darker. "I turn 30 next month. I'll have lived longer than she did. It feels like I'm erasing her somehow, living past her story." And there it was. Julia saw how the pattern shifted with this revelation, understanding blooming like one of Stephanie's mother's flowers. The severances weren't just about grief anymore. They were about fear of moving forward, of letting new connections replace old ones. "What if," Julia suggested carefully, her hands moving to the loom again, "I showed you how these patterns work, how connections don't erase each other, but build upon what came before?" Stephanie looked up sharply, and Julia saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition of a truth she wasn't ready to face, or perhaps fear of that same truth. "I should go," Stephanie said, standing abruptly. There are things I need to do." But before she could reach the door, Julia called out, "She kept caterpillars in jars, didn't she? To show you how they changed into butterflies." Stephanie froze, her hand on the door handle. "How did you—" "The threads, remember," Julia said simply. "That connection between a mother teaching her daughter about transformation, it's one of the oldest patterns there is." For a moment, the void around Stephanie seemed to lighten. The golden thread pulsed once, strongly, before fading back to its barely visible state. "Same time tomorrow?" Julia asked, not pushing further. "The loom helps, even if you don't believe in what it shows." Stephanie didn't answer, but she didn't immediately leave either. She stood there, caught between flight and recognition, while Julia continued her weaving. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she slipped out into the morning light. Julia sat back, studying the pattern that had emerged on her loom. Among the usual interweavings of town life, She could now see something new forming, a design that incorporated both darkness and light, both severed ends and new beginnings. The work ahead would be delicate. Teaching Stephanie to see the threads was only part of it. The harder task would be helping her understand that moving forward didn't mean leaving her mother behind. Outside, the town continued its daily rhythm, connections forming and fading in their natural cycle. But here in her shop, before her ancient loom, Julia finally began to see how all the threads, even the broken ones, might be rewoven into something new. She just hoped she had enough time before the severances spread too far. The loom hummed beneath her hands, its wisdom accumulated over centuries of witnessing human connection. Tomorrow would bring another chance to help Stephanie see what Julia saw, that every ending contained within it the seeds of new beginnings. For now, she wove, strengthening the patterns that remained while preparing for the deeper work to come. The early morning light caught the dust motes dancing between Julia's loom threads, each particle trailing its own gossamer connections through the air. She sat adjusting the tension, preparing for the day's lesson, though Stephanie hadn't actually agreed to come back. The bell chimed at precisely 8 o'clock. "You knew I'd return," Stephanie said, not quite a question. She stood in the doorway, clutching a leather-bound journal, her mother's, Julia guessed by the complex weave of faded connections surrounding it. "The threads suggested you might," Julia replied, patting the stool beside her. "They remember patterns, even when we try to forget them." Stephanie approached cautiously, the void around her rippling through the shop's usual tapestry of connections. But something had shifted since yesterday. The severances weren't spreading quite as actively, as if Stephanie's awareness of them had created a kind of hesitation. "First rule of weaving," Julia said, guiding Stephanie's hands to the loom's frame, "is learning to feel the tension. Too tight, and the threads break. Too loose, and the pattern falls apart." "Like relationships," Stephanie murmured, then looked startled at her own observation. Julia nodded, hiding a smile. "Exactly. Watch how the shuttle moves." Her hands demonstrated the smooth motion, creating a rhythm as old as human connection itself. Through the corner of her eye, she saw that golden thread around Stephanie pulse stronger. "My mother," Stephanie said suddenly, opening the journal. "She wrote about weaving. I never knew she—" She trailed off, showing Julia a page filled with sketches of patterns. "May I?" Julia asked, gently taking the journal. The sketches were beautiful, complex designs that echoed the true patterns of human connection with uncanny accuracy. She could see them, couldn't she? Not quite like I do, but she sensed them. Stephanie's breath caught. Around them the threads shifted, responding to this revelation. She used to say she could feel when people needed her garden's help, like the plants told her who should have which flowers. "Plants have their own kind of threads," Julia explained, returning to the loom. "They remember connections too. Here, place your hands over mine. Feel how the shuttle wants to move." As Stephanie complied, Julia felt the loom's resonance change. The ancient wood seemed to recognize something in Stephanie's touch, responding with a deeper hum. Together, they began to weave, their movements synchronized by the loom's rhythm. "Tell me about the garden," Julia prompted softly, keeping their hands moving steadily. "The one you remember from childhood." "It was wild," Stephanie said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality as she fell into the weaving's rhythm. "Not messy, but alive. Mum always said gardens shouldn't be too controlled. She planted things that wanted to grow together, even if the combinations seemed strange." As she spoke, Julia watched the threads around her shift, The void was still there, but now she could see something else, tiny filaments of new connection trying to form, only to be snapped by Stephanie's unconscious resistance. The butterfly bushes, Stephanie continued. They were her favourite. She'd spend hours watching the chrysalises, waiting for... She stopped abruptly, her hands stilling on the loom. Another thread snapped, dissolving into the morning light. "Keep weaving," Julia encouraged gently. "The pattern wants to continue, even when we think we can't." Stephanie's hands resumed their motion, though Julia could feel them trembling. "I found caterpillars in my own garden last week. First ones since before. I had to cut down the butterfly bush, couldn't watch them transform." Understanding bloomed in Julia's mind. Because transformation means letting go of what was before. The void around Stephanie pulsed darker, but she kept weaving, her movements becoming almost desperate. "If I change, if I let life become something new, then I'm leaving her behind, living past her story, becoming someone she never got to know. Or," Julia suggested carefully, "you're continuing her story, adding new chapters she helped write even if she couldn't be here to see them." Their hands moved together, the shuttle passing back and forth in ancient rhythm. On the loom, a pattern was emerging, something neither of them had consciously planned. It showed transformations, caterpillars becoming butterflies, seeds becoming flowers, grief becoming something else. "I don't know how," Stephanie whispered, but her hands kept moving, guided by the loom's wisdom. "That's why we practice," Julia said simply. "One thread at a time, one pattern at a time, until we learn to trust the weaving." They worked in silence as morning deepened around them. Julia watched as tiny new connections began to form around Stephanie, delicate as spider silk, fragile as hope, but present. Most dissolved almost immediately, but a few lingered, strengthened by the act of creation they shared. The bell chimed, announcing Martha with her usual morning tea. She took in the scene and quietly left her offering, understanding the delicacy of the moment. As she departed, Julia saw one of the new threads connect briefly with Martha's complex weave of relationships before dissolving. But it had connected. For just a moment it had held. "Same time tomorrow?" Julia asked as they finished the morning's work. "The loom helps us remember things our hands once knew, even if our minds try to forget." Stephanie stared at their shared creation, her fingers tracing the pattern of transformation they'd woven. Yes, I think so." She gathered her mother's journal and left, the void around her slightly less absolute than when she'd arrived. Julia remained at the loom, studying what they'd created together. Among the threads of butterfly wings and growing things, she saw something else emerging, a pattern of healing that might, with time and care, help Stephanie weave her mother's story into her own. The day stretched ahead, full of customers trailing their beautiful, complex webs of connection. But now Julia had hope. The severed threads could be re-woven, not into what they were before, but into something new, something that honoured both what was lost and what might yet become. The ancient loom hummed beneath her hands, its wisdom accumulated over centuries of witnessing such transformations. Outside, she thought she saw a butterfly pass the window, its wings catching the morning light like threads of possibility. The butterfly bush appeared on Julia's doorstep before dawn, a healthy specimen with deep purple blooms, its roots carefully wrapped in damp burlap. No note accompanied it, but Julia didn't need one. She could see Stephanie's threads all over it, faint but present, trying to form new connections even as old ones dissolved. Inside the shop, Julia positioned the plant where it would catch the morning light. The threads around it shimmered with potential, not just Stephanie's nascent attempts at connection, but older patterns too. This particular variety of butterfly bush had been a favourite in her mother's garden, its lineage traceable through cuttings shared between neighbours over decades. When Stephanie arrived for her lesson, she froze at the sight of the bush. The void around her pulsed darker, but Julia noticed it didn't spread quite as actively as before. "I wasn't sure," Stephanie said, her voice barely audible, "if you'd understand what it meant." "The threads remember," Julia replied simply, moving to her loom. "Come, today we're going to try something different." She had set up a smaller loom beside her own, the one her grandmother had used to teach her. Its wood held decades of beginner's lessons, humming with accumulated patience. "Two looms?" Stephanie asked, anxiety edging her voice. "It's time you learned to weave your own patterns," Julia explained. "Watch first, then mirror what I do." They began slowly, Julia demonstrating basic movements while Stephanie copied them. The rhythm of parallel shuttles filled the shop, creating harmonies in the threads only Julia could see. But something in Stephanie's posture suggested she was starting to sense them too. "Tell me about the journals," Julia prompted gently, keeping their movements synchronized. "Not just what they say, tell me about finding them." Stephanie's hands faltered slightly but found the rhythm again. "The attic was so hot that day. Everything smelled like dust and old wood. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just checking for roof damage after the storm." As she spoke, Julia watched the threads around her shift. The void was still there, but now she could see something moving within it, memories taking shape like shadows in deep water. "The box was behind some old Christmas decorations," Stephanie continued, her shuttle moving steadily now. "I recognised her handwriting on the label. Garden Dreams," she'd written. Just that. "And you opened it right there?" Julia kept her voice neutral, encouraging. "No." Stephanie's hands stilled momentarily. "I took it downstairs first, made tea in her favourite cup, the one with the roses that Dad always said was too fancy for everyday use. It felt important somehow to use that cup." Julia saw the golden thread pulse stronger at this mention of ritual, of conscious connection with memory. The cup made her feel closer. "Yes, no, I don't know." Stephanie resumed weaving, her movements becoming more confident. "It made everything feel more real, like I was finally letting myself remember her as a whole person, not just the accident." The void rippled, and Julia saw more threads trying to form, delicate filaments of new connection reaching out before being snapped by old fear. But they were trying. That was something. "The journals," Julia prompted. "What did they tell you?" "Everything, nothing. She had so many plans." Stephanie's voice caught. Designs for gardens she never got to plant, ideas for teaching children about butterflies. She wanted to see me graduate, get married, have children of my own to teach about chrysalises and transformation. Another thread snapped, but this time Julia saw something remarkable. A tiny new connection formed almost immediately in its place, anchored by their shared weaving rhythm. "She wrote about you," Stephanie added quietly, "about buying yarn here, about patterns she wanted to try. She said some people just understand how things grow together. Plants, people, patterns. She said you were one of those people." Julia felt the truth of this settle into her bones. She remembered Sarah Marshall's visits to the shop, how her threads had shown such potential for seeing the connections herself. If she had lived. "Your mother had the gift," Julia said carefully. "Not quite like mine, but she could sense the patterns. And now—" "No." Stephanie's hands clenched on her shuttle. "I can't. I'd ruin it, just like I ruin everything that tries to grow." "Look at what you're weaving," Julia instructed softly. Stephanie glanced down at her work, really seeing it for the first time. Without conscious thought, she had created a pattern of butterfly wings and garden paths, echoing the designs in her mother's journal. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I wasn't trying to." "Exactly," Julia said. "The patterns are already in you, waiting to be woven, just like her gift is in you, waiting to be recognised." The void around Stephanie trembled. Julia watched as more tiny connections formed, some dissolving immediately, but others holding for longer each time. The butterfly bush's threads reached toward Stephanie like tentative hope. "I don't know if I can," Stephanie said, but her hands kept moving, kept creating. "You already are," Julia told her. "Every time you let yourself remember her as she was, a whole person, with dreams and gifts of her own, you weave her story into yours. The patterns don't break, Stephanie. They transform." They worked in silence as morning deepened around them. On their parallel looms, similar but distinct patterns emerged, Julia's showing the complex weave of town connections, Stephanie's revealing a tentative map of memory and possibility. The butterfly bush caught the light, its flowers drawing actual butterflies to the window. Julia watched Stephanie watch them, seeing how the void around her flickered with something that might have been recognition. The work wasn't finished. There were more lessons ahead, more patterns to understand. But today, sitting at parallel looms in the gentle morning light, they had begun to weave something new from the threads of what was lost. Outside, butterflies danced like living threads, connecting past to present, with each beat of their wings. The storm arrived without warning, dark clouds gathering above the shop, as Julia and Stephanie worked at their looms. But Julia had seen it coming in the threads. They had been growing taut all morning, vibrating with approaching crisis. The void around Stephanie had deepened, pulsing with something darker than its usual grief. "Something's wrong," Julia said, watching Stephanie's increasingly erratic movements at the loom. The pattern she'd been weaving, a delicate design of butterfly wings and garden paths, was becoming tangled, threads snapping under too much tension. "I found more journals." Stephanie's voice cracked. Hidden ones, deep in the attic. She knew, Julia. She wrote about feelings, premonitions. The day before the accident, she wrote about butterflies dying in their chrysalises. Thunder rolled overhead as Stephanie's control finally broke. The shuttle clattered to the floor, and with it came a wave of severances more violent than anything Julia had yet witnessed. Threads snapped in dozens, then hundreds, dissolving into the charged air. "She knew!" Stephanie cried, standing so abruptly her stool toppled. "She could feel it coming, and she still got in that car, still took me with her. How could she?" Julia moved to comfort her, but the void around Stephanie had become absolute, severing any connection that came near. Around them, the shop's tapestry of relationships was unraveling at an alarming rate. Even the butterfly bush's leaves were wilting, its threads dissolving under the onslaught of Stephanie's pain. "Your mother's gift," Julia said carefully. "It wasn't about predicting the future. It was about seeing connections. Sometimes those connections show us things we don't want to see." "Stop!" Stephanie pressed her hands to her ears. "Stop trying to make it mean something. She left me. She knew and she left me, and now I can't. I can't." Lightning flashed, illuminating the shop in stark bursts. In those frozen moments, Julia saw the full extent of the damage. The severances were spreading beyond the shop now, reaching out into the town. She could feel connections snapping all along Main Street, decades of relationships dissolving in seconds. "Stephanie," Julia's voice took on an edge of urgency. "You have to listen. What you're doing, what you're feeling, it's affecting more than just you. The threads." "I don't care about your threads," Stephanie shouted. "They're not real. None of this is real. It's just yarn and old wood and crazy stories about connections that don't matter." But even as she denied them, Julia saw Stephanie's eyes tracking the dissolving threads. Some part of her could see them now, could sense the destruction she was causing. The knowledge only seemed to feed her pain. "They do matter," Julia insisted, moving toward her ancient loom. "Every connection matters, even the broken ones, even the ones that hurt. Watch." Her hands moved across the loom with practiced speed, weaving a pattern she'd never attempted before. As she worked, the threads began to glow with their own light, showing connections spanning generations. There was Sarah Marshall teaching Martha Chen about butterfly gardens. There was Stephanie as a child, helping her mother plant seeds that would feed half the town. There was the accident, yes, but also everything that came before and after, all the lives touched, all the connections formed. "Look," Julia commanded, "really look. Your mother's thread didn't end with her death. It transformed. Every garden she planted, every person she helped, every moment she shared, they're all still here, woven into the town's pattern. Even the pain is part of the design." Stephanie stared at the glowing threads, her breathing ragged. "I can see them," she whispered. "Oh God, I can see them. And I'm destroying them." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She staggered, catching herself on Julia's loom. The contact sent a shock through the threads, not severing this time, but something else, something like recognition. "I can't," Stephanie choked out. "I can't watch them break anymore. I can't be here. I can't." She turned and fled into the storm, the bell's chime lost in a crack of thunder. Julia moved to follow, but stopped at her door. Through the rain, she watched Stephanie run down Main Street, the void around her pulling at every connection she passed. But something had changed. The severances weren't spreading as violently now. Instead, the broken threads hung in the air like questions waiting to be answered. Julia returned to her loom, her hands trembling as she assessed the damage. So many connections severed, so many patterns disrupted. It would take time to repair what had been broken, if it could be repaired at all. The butterfly bush's leaves stirred in a breeze that shouldn't have reached it. Julia looked closer and saw that a single chrysalis had appeared on one of its branches, its threads glowing with weak but persistent light. "Transformation," she murmured, understanding blooming like hope. It was never about preventing the breaking. It was about what comes after. Outside, the storm began to ease, though its echoes remained in the charged air. Julia sat at her loom and began to weave, strengthening what connections remained while leaving space for new ones to form. Stephanie would return when she was ready. The threads, and the chrysalis, told her that much. For now, Julia could only do what she did best: observe, maintain, and trust in the pattern's ability to heal itself. The loom hummed beneath her hands, its ancient wisdom a reminder that some things had to break completely before they could become something new. Three days passed before Stephanie returned. Julia felt her approaching through the threads. The void around her had changed, becoming less absolute, more permeable, like a chrysalis beginning to thin before transformation. The bell chimed softly as Stephanie entered, carrying her mother's journals and something else, a small box wrapped in faded floral paper. Her eyes were red but clear, holding a steadiness Julia hadn't seen before. "I found this," Stephanie said, placing the box on the counter, "in the back of her closet. It was wrapped for my 30th birthday. Her fingers traced the paper's worn edges. "Next week. She wrapped it 15 years ago." Julia watched the threads around the box pulse with stored memory. "Have you opened it?" "Not yet." Stephanie moved to her loom, and Julia noticed she had begun thinking of it as Stephanie's loom, not just the teaching one. I needed to be here first. To understand something." She sat down, her hands finding their place on the frame with unconscious familiarity. Julia took her own seat, watching as new connections began forming around Stephanie, fragile still, but no longer dissolving immediately. "Show me what you see," Stephanie said quietly. "All of it, I'm ready now." Julia took a deep breath and began to weave, letting her sight expand to its fullest. The threads became more visible, their patterns more complex. She heard Stephanie's small gasp as the connections became clear to her too. "There," Julia pointed with her shuttle. "See how Mrs. Chen's thread connects to your mother's garden? The lavender she planted still grows there, its cuttings spread through half the town's gardens. And there, the Peterson kids who learned about butterflies from your mother, their own children now raise monarchs every summer." Stephanie's hands began to move, her weaving falling into rhythm with Julia's. "I can see them. All the places she touched, all the connections she made. They're still growing." "Your mother understood patterns," Julia explained gently. "Not quite like I do, but in her own way. The gardens she planned, the relationships she nurtured, they were her way of weaving connections." "And I've been breaking them," Stephanie's voice caught, but her hands kept moving. "All these years pushing people away, refusing to let anything grow." "You were protecting yourself," Julia corrected. "But now you can see the whole pattern. Breaking connections doesn't erase pain. It just passes it on, spreads it through the web of relationships until everyone feels the loss." They worked in silence for a while, their parallel weaving creating harmonies in the threads around them. Julia watched as Stephanie unconsciously began repairing connections, her pattern incorporating both old threads and new ones. "The butterfly bush," Stephanie said suddenly. "The one I left here. It was from her original garden, wasn't it? A cutting I took before I cut down the rest." Julia nodded. "Life finds ways to continue, even when we try to end it. Look." She gestured to the chrysalis, now dark with approaching transformation. "Some endings are just beginnings in disguise." Stephanie's hands stilled on her loom. She looked at the wrapped gift, its threads pulsing with 15 years of stored anticipation. I think I'm ready to open it." She lifted the box carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as they found the tape's edge. Julia watched the threads around it brighten as paper fell away, revealing a small wooden box carved with butterflies. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a shuttle, old but well maintained, its wood dark with years of use. A note rested beside it, the paper soft with age. "For my daughter who will understand patterns in her own time, in her own way. Love transcends all transformations. Mom." The golden thread that Julia had seen around Stephanie from the beginning suddenly blazed bright, revealing its true nature. Not a broken connection at all, but one that had transformed, becoming something that existed beyond ordinary sight. "She knew," Stephanie whispered, lifting the shuttle. "Not about the accident, but about this, about who I could become." "The threads remember," Julia said softly. "Even when we forget, they hold the pattern for us until we're ready to see it again." Stephanie returned to her loom, her mother's shuttle fitting perfectly in her hands. As she began to weave, Julia saw connections repairing themselves, not just around Stephanie, but spreading outward, strengthening the town's damaged tapestry of relationships. "Teach me everything," Stephanie said, her voice stronger now. "Not just about weaving, but about seeing the patterns, understanding the connections. I want to continue her work, my work, our work." Julia smiled, seeing the truth of transformation in every thread around them. "We start with the basics, tension and release, pattern and flow. The rest will come as you're ready for it." Outside, butterflies danced around blooming flowers, their wings catching light like living threads. Inside, 2 women wove together, repairing what had been broken while creating something entirely new. The chrysalis darkened further, its transformation nearly complete. Like Stephanie herself, it waited for the perfect moment to reveal what it had always been meant to become. The ancient loom hummed with approval as past and future wove themselves together into an eternal present, each thread finding its place in the ever-growing pattern of connection and renewal. The morning of Stephanie's 30th birthday dawned with unusual clarity. Julia arrived early to find her already at the loom, working with quiet intensity. Her mother's shuttle moved smoothly through threads that glowed with strengthening connections. "I had a dream last night," Stephanie said without looking up, "about Mum's garden, but it wasn't just as it was. I could see all the connections, how each plant linked to different people, different moments, like your threads but with roots and growth instead of just light." Julia studied the pattern taking shape on Stephanie's loom. It showed gardens, not just her mother's, but all the gardens that had grown from it. Each flower, each shared cutting, each lesson about butterflies had created connections that spread through the town like living roots. "Your mother's gift," Julia said, settling at her own loom. "It wasn't so different from mine. She saw patterns in growth, in the way living things connect and support each other. The threads just show it differently." The chrysalis on the butterfly bush had darkened to near black, its transformation almost complete. As they worked, Julia watched the threads around it pulse in rhythm with their weaving. "I found more journals," Stephanie continued, her shuttle never pausing. "Earlier ones, from before I was born. She wrote about you, about coming to the shop when she was pregnant. She could sense something here, something about the loom and the connections it showed." Julia remembered those visits. Sarah Marshall standing in this same spot, her threads showing such potential for seeing the patterns herself. She understood more than she wrote down. Some things can't be captured in words. Like this. Stephanie's hands moved in a complex pattern, and suddenly the threads around her loom became more visible, showing connections she was only beginning to understand. "I can see them clearer now. Not just the broken ones, but the ones that transformed, changed into something new without really ending." "Yes," Julia said softly, "exactly like that." They worked in companionable silence as morning light filled the shop. Julia watched Stephanie's growing confidence with the threads, how she was learning to strengthen connections without forcing them. The void around her had transformed too, becoming less an absence and more a space of possibility. The bell chimed, and Martha Chen entered carrying not just tea but a small pot of lavender, a cutting from Sarah Marshall's original plant. "Happy birthday, dear," she said, placing both offerings on the counter. "Your mother would be proud of who you're becoming." Something shifted in the threads at those words. The golden connection that had always surrounded Stephanie pulsed brightly, and suddenly Julia could see its full pattern, not just a link to memory, but a living connection that had grown and changed over 15 years. "Look," Julia said gently. "Really look at how your mother's thread continues. It's not just memory anymore. It's become part of how you see the world, how you understand connections." Stephanie's hands stilled on her loom as she focused on the threads around her. Her eyes widened as she finally saw what Julia had been trying to show her all along. Her mother's influence hadn't ended with her death, but had transformed into something new, something that grew stronger with each connection Stephanie herself made. "The garden club called yesterday," Stephanie said, her voice thick with emotion. They want me to help restore the butterfly garden at the elementary school. Mum designed it before. They said the children miss seeing the monarchs." Martha smiled, her own threads showing years of tending both plants and relationships. "Gardens need people who understand patterns, who see how things grow together." "I was afraid," Stephanie admitted, returning to her weaving, afraid that moving forward, finding my own way meant leaving her behind. But it's not like that at all, is it? "No," Julia confirmed. "Every new connection you make, every pattern you help create, it builds on what she taught you, transforms it into something new while honouring what came before." The chrysalis suddenly moved, a small crack appearing in its surface. All three women watched as a butterfly slowly emerged, its wings still wet with transformation. 30 years, Stephanie whispered. "I've lived longer than she did now, but I'm not erasing her story. I'm continuing it, adding new chapters she helped write, even if she couldn't be here to see them." "That's what patterns do," Julia said, seeing how the threads around them had strengthened, connections repaired and transformed rather than simply restored. They continue, growing in ways we can't predict but somehow always staying true to their essential nature. The butterfly's wings dried as they watched, its colours deepening. Around it, threads of connection shimmered, to the bush that had hosted it, to the garden it came from, to all the people who would see it fly and remember a woman who had taught them to value such moments. Stephanie returned to her weaving with renewed purpose, her pattern now incorporating both past and future, both memory and possibility. The void around her had become a space of creation rather than loss. "I think I understand now," she said quietly, "about the loom, about what you've been trying to teach me. It's not just about seeing connections. It's about helping them grow, transform, become what they need to be." Julia nodded, seeing in Stephanie's threads the same potential she had once seen in her mother's. That's the true pattern, not preventing change but helping it happen in ways that strengthen rather than sever. The butterfly took flight, circling the shop once before finding the open window. As it disappeared into the morning light, Julia saw all the threads it carried with it, connections that would continue to grow and transform, touching lives in ways no one could predict, just like Sarah Marshall's gift, living on through her daughter's growing understanding of patterns and possibilities. The ancient loom hummed with approval as mother and daughter, past and future, loss and renewal, all wove themselves into a single continuing story. A year had passed since Stephanie's 30th birthday. The butterfly bush that had marked her transformation now filled Julia's shop window, its branches heavy with both blooms and chrysalises. But more remarkable were the threads around it, complex weaves of connection that showed how many lives it had touched through shared cuttings and gathered seeds. Julia sat at her loom, watching Stephanie work with a group of children from the elementary school. They gathered around her smaller loom, their threads bright with curiosity and wonder as she taught them about patterns, about connection, about transformation. "See how the threads want to work together." Stephanie guided a small hand through the motion of the shuttle. "Just like in the garden, every plant, every butterfly, every person has their own pattern. Our job is to help them find ways to grow together." The children's connections shimmered with understanding beyond their years. Julia saw how their threads were already incorporating what they learned here, creating new patterns that would spread through their families, their school, their future lives. "Miss Stephanie," one little girl asked, her threads glowing particularly bright, "is it true you can see the butterflies before they hatch, like your mum could?" Stephanie's hands stilled briefly on her loom, but there was no darkness in her paws now. "Something like that," she said with a gentle smile. "My mum taught me that everything shows us its pattern if we learn to look properly. The butterflies, the gardens, even the connections between people." Julia watched the golden thread that connected Stephanie to her mother's memory pulse with warm light. It had grown stronger over the months, transforming from a link to the past into something that actively guided Stephanie's future. The bell chimed as Martha entered with her usual tea offering. The children greeted her enthusiastically, their threads reaching out to connect with her complex weave of relationships. She had become a regular presence at their lessons, sharing her own knowledge of how plants and people grew together. The garden club meeting is this afternoon, Martha reminded them. They're very excited about your plans for expanding the butterfly sanctuaries. Stephanie nodded, her threads showing quiet confidence where once there had been only void. Mum's journals gave me some ideas. She had plans drawn up for connecting the gardens throughout town, creating corridors for the monarchs. I think it's time to make those plans reality. The children returned to their weaving lesson, each creating small but perfect patterns that reflected their growing understanding. Julia saw how Stephanie guided them with the same gentle wisdom her mother had once shown, not forcing connections, but helping them discover how things naturally grew together. As afternoon light filled the shop, the last child departed clutching a carefully wrapped cutting from the butterfly bush. Stephanie watched them go, her threads showing how each small connection added to the greater pattern she was helping to create. "You've gone beyond what I could teach you," Julia said softly. "You've found your own way of seeing patterns, of helping them grow." Stephanie turned to her mentor, emotion making her threads shimmer. "I couldn't have done it without you showing me how to look, how to understand what Mum was trying to teach me all along." Together they stood before their looms, Julia's ancient one, and Stephanie's that had once been used for teaching, but had become something more. Their parallel weaving showed two different ways of seeing the same truth, that connections never truly broke, they just transformed into new patterns waiting to be understood. "The threads are stronger now," Stephanie observed, looking out at the town through the window. "Not just mine, but everyone's, like we're all learning to see how we're connected." Julia nodded, watching the complex weave of relationships that spread out from her shop. Each thread told a story, of gardens shared, of butterflies released, of wisdom passed down through generations, and at the centre of many new connections sat Stephanie, no longer breaking threads, but helping them grow in new directions. The butterfly bush rustled as another chrysalis began to crack, its transformation perfectly timed as always. They watched together as new life emerged, carrying with it threads of connection that would spread far beyond their sight. "Mum would have loved this," Stephanie said, but her voice held joy now rather than pain. Not just the butterflies, but all of it, the teaching, the gardens, the way everything connects. "She sees it," Julia said simply. "Her pattern lives in every connection you help create, every garden you help grow, every child you teach to look beneath the surface of things." The late afternoon sun caught the threads around them, making them glow with possibilities yet to be woven. Julia saw how her own pattern had changed too. No longer just an observer of connections, but a teacher of those who could help them grow. Martha brought fresh tea as they settled back at their looms. The three women worked in comfortable silence, each contributing to the greater pattern in their own way. Outside, butterflies danced between flowers that Sarah Marshall had first planted, their wings carrying threads of connection through time and space. The ancient loom hummed with satisfaction as past and future, mother and daughter, loss and renewal all found their place in the ever-growing tapestry of connection. Julia watched Stephanie begin a new pattern, one that incorporated all she had learned while creating something entirely her own. The threads showed truth beyond words. Some patterns didn't end with loss, they just transformed into new ways of growing together, and in that transformation, they became even more beautiful than before. Evening light painted the shop in soft colours as they continued their work, each thread adding to a pattern that would continue long after they were gone. The butterfly bush stood witness, its branches already holding next season's chrysalises, proof that every ending contained within it the seeds of new beginnings. And somewhere, in the threads that connected them all, Sarah Marshall's pattern lived on, not just remembered, but growing still through her daughter's gift for helping things transform and thrive together. The weaving continued as it always had, as it always would, each thread, each pattern, each transformation, all part of a greater design that connected them all.
Thank you for illuminating your imagination with the listening lamp. If our tale has sparked a light in your mind, we invite you to keep that flame burning. Subscribe to our podcast and join us again as we continue to explore the vast cosmos of human experience. Until next time, may your inner light guide you through the mysteries that await.